The crunch comes first. Metal folding wrong. A wheel spinning loose on the floor. My son's wheelchair lies on its side in the aisle. One wheel still turning, ticking like a clock running out of time. "It was blocking the walkway," she screams. "Someone had to move it." Her voice fills the whole cabin. Passengers freeze in their seats. My hands are shaking, but my training says stay still. I look down at Danny. His face has gone white. His hands grip the armrest so hard his knuckles turn pale. 14 years old, and I watch him shrink into himself. She stands over the broken chair in a cobalt blue blazer, chin lifted, daring anyone to challenge her. A flight attendant kneels beside the wreckage, her hands hovering, unsure what to fix first. I smell burnt coffee. I hear the hum of the engines. I taste copper in my mouth from biting my own cheek. Danny whispers, "Mom, I can't feel my legs without it. I can't move." 20 other passengers watch, some record with their phones. Nobody moves to help. The woman in blue turns toward me, eyes narrow, unbothered by the panic she has caused. "Are you going to say something?" she asks. "Or are you just going to sit there?" I could tell her who I am right now. I could end this in one sentence. But not yet. Some storms need to build before they break. But to understand why this moment changed everything, I need to take you back to where this all began. My name is Rachel Monroe, and 6 hours earlier, I was just another tired mother trying to get her son home for his birthday. I had spent 18 years flying jets across oceans, though nobody on this aircraft knew that yet. My uniform was folded in my carry-on bag, not on my body, because today I was not working. Today I was only a mother, sitting beside her son on Flight 2287, heading home to Denver for his 15th birthday. Danny was paralyzed from the waist down after a car accident 3 years earlier, an accident that took his father and nearly took him too. Since then, it had been the two of us, learning a new kind of life together, one appointment and one small victory at a time. His wheelchair was not just equipment. It was his freedom, custom-fitted, adjusted a dozen times by specialists who understood exactly how much independence he had left to protect. The gate area that morning had been ordinary. Coffee cups, rolling suitcases, a toddler chasing pigeons near the window. Danny had been laughing at something on his phone, the kind of laugh I did not hear often enough anymore. I remember thinking this trip would be simple. Boarding, a short flight, a birthday dinner waiting at home with his grandmother's lasagna. 23 years of training had taught me to stay calm in situations far worse than a crowded airplane cabin. I did not think I would need that training today. I was wrong. The gate agent had been kind, pre-boarding us early so Danny could transfer into his aisle seat before the crowd arrived. The flight attendants greeted him by name because I had called ahead, because that was what careful mothers did. Everything about that morning felt gentle, unremarkable, safe. I settled into the seat beside him, tucked his blanket over his knees, and watched other passengers file past us one by one. An older man nodded politely. A young woman offered to help lift his bag into the overhead bin. The world, for a few minutes, looked kind. Then she boarded. She moved down the aisle like the plane belonged to her. Cobalt blue blazer pressed sharp, matching trousers, blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Her heels clicked against the floor with a rhythm that demanded attention. Before she even reached our row, she stopped beside a young mother struggling with a diaper bag. "This is economy," she said loudly. "Not a nursery. Control your child or I will call a flight attendant myself." The young mother apologized, cheeks burning, and shoved the bag beneath her seat. Nobody defended her. The woman in blue simply moved on, satisfied, like she had won something small and necessary. I felt my stomach tighten. Something about her energy did not fit inside an aircraft cabin. It fit somewhere with a clipboard and a rulebook only she could read. She reached our row and paused. Her eyes moved from Danny's wheelchair, folded and tagged near the closet, to his legs, to his face, lingering a half-second too long. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes, and walked on to her seat 2 rows behind us. That smile stayed with me longer than it should have. Her name, I would later learn, was Deborah Ashcroft, and she introduced herself to the cabin the way most people introduce a job title. She sat down hard, dropped her bag onto the seat beside her without asking the neighboring passenger, and announced to no one in particular that she expected the crew to move quickly today because her schedule did not allow for delays. Her blazer looked expensive, tailored, the kind of clothing meant to project authority in a room that had given her none. Her posture stayed rigid even seated, shoulders back, chin high, scanning the cabin like she was cataloging every flaw she intended to report. The first small incident happened during boarding, when a teenage boy accidentally bumped her elbow reaching for the overhead bin. "Watch where you are going," she snapped, loud enough that 3 rows turned to look. "Some of us have places to be." The boy mumbled an apology and hurried to his seat, red-faced, humiliated over something that should have been nothing. I watched her settle back with visible satisfaction, as if she had just corrected an injustice against herself. It was such a small moment, almost forgettable, except it was not, because it told me exactly the kind of day we were about to have. A flight attendant walked past offering pillows, and Deborah snapped her fingers to get her attention. "I need a window seat," she said. "This one has a broken tray table." The tray table was fine. The flight attendant checked it twice, found nothing wrong, and gently explained the flight was full. Deborah's jaw tightened. Her eyes swept the cabin until they landed, again on Danny. "There is an empty window seat," she said, pointing directly at us. "Right there next to the wheelchair boy." The cabin went quiet. Danny's shoulders dropped an inch, the way they always did when strangers reduced him to his chair instead of his name. I felt the dread settle into my chest before she even opened her mouth again. She stood up, smoothed her blazer, and began walking toward our row with the calm certainty of someone who had never once in her life been told no. The flight attendant tried to intervene before Deborah reached us. "Ma'am, that seat is already assigned," she said gently. "I can find you another option once we're airborne." "I did not ask for options," Deborah said. "I asked for a working seat." She stopped directly beside our row, looking down at Danny like he was an obstacle in a hallway rather than a boy on his way home for his birthday. "You," she said, "in the wheelchair, this seat next to you. I need it." I kept my voice level. "This is our row. We're seated together for a reason." "That is not my problem," she said. "I paid for comfort, not to sit next to medical equipment for 3 hours." A man across the aisle turned, frowning, but said nothing. The young mother from earlier looked away, still shaken from her own encounter minutes before. The flight attendant stepped closer, professional despite the tension rising around her. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. We're preparing for departure." Deborah ignored her entirely, eyes locked on me. "Move him, or move yourself. Either way, I am not standing here." Danny's fingers curled tighter around his blanket. I placed a hand gently over his and kept my voice quiet, steady, the tone I used in situations that required exactly zero escalation. "We're not moving," I said. "There are other seats available. I'm sure the crew can help you find one." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she stepped back, just slightly, just enough to look defeated in front of an audience she had gathered without meaning to. Inside, I felt something tighten, an old instinct sharpening quietly beneath the surface. I had spent years learning that the calmest voice in the room usually wins. I chose calm. I chose peace. I told myself this was simply one difficult passenger among thousands I had encountered over the years. Danny leaned toward me slightly, voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, is she gone?" "For now," I said, squeezing his hand once before releasing it. He nodded, though his eyes stayed fixed on the aisle, watching for her shadow the way a person watches for weather they already know is coming. I did not yet know how wrong that assumption would prove to be. 3 minutes later, everything changed. Deborah returned to her original seat, but her silence did not last. She began speaking louder to the passenger beside her, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Some people bring their problems onto a plane and expect everyone else to accommodate them," she said. It is not my fault they didn't plan properly for a child like that. Danny's eyes dropped to his lap. I watched his jaw tighten the way it always did when strangers spoke about him instead of to him. A woman near the window leaned toward her row mate and whispered something disapproving, but no one spoke up directly. The flight attendant reappeared, this time firmer. "Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice and remain seated for departure." "Or what?" Deborah said, standing again despite the seatbelt sign now illuminated above her head. "You'll write me up? Go ahead. I've flown this airline for 20 years. She stepped into the aisle, blocking it entirely, and looked back toward us with something colder than irritation now settling into her expression. An older man too rose up, finally spoke. "Ma'am, please sit down. You're holding up the flight." She turned on him instantly. "Mind your own business," she snapped. "This does not concern you." He raised his hands and looked away, unwilling to engage further. A young man across the aisle lifted his phone and began recording quietly, angling it low so she would not notice. Deborah's attention snapped back to Danny's wheelchair, folded neatly by the closet where crew had secured it before departure. "That thing is a hazard," she said. "It's blocking emergency access. I want it removed." The flight attendant explained calmly that it was properly stowed according to regulation, secured exactly where policy required. Deborah was not listening anymore. She stepped toward the closet, reaching for the folded chair like she intended to move it herself. "Ma'am, please don't touch that," the flight attendant said, alarm entering her voice for the first time. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stood, every calm instinct in my body screaming to intervene before this became something none of us could undo. "That's my son's chair," I said, voice low, steady, final. "Please step away from it." She looked at me, something sharp flickering behind her eyes. "Or what?" she said. "You'll cry about it?" Danny's hand found mine, gripping it tightly, and I chose, one more time, to stay calm. The wheel struck the floor before I even understood what had happened. Deborah had shoved the folded chair sideways, hard, trying to force it deeper into the closet to make a point about space that did not need making. It tipped, caught on the closet track, and crashed into the aisle floor with a metallic crack that silenced the entire cabin. One wheel snapped free from its axle and rolled slowly down the aisle before falling still. Danny made a sound I had never heard from him before, something between a gasp and a whimper, his hands flying to grip the armrests as if the ground itself had shifted beneath him. "That thing is a hazard," Deborah said, stepping over the wreckage without looking down. "I told you it needed to be moved. You broke my son's wheelchair." My voice came out louder than I intended, echoing through the cabin, and every head turned toward us. Deborah's expression barely changed. "It's plastic and metal," she said. "It's not like he can't get a new one." The cruelty of that sentence landed like a physical blow. Danny's face crumpled, and for a moment, he looked exactly like the frightened boy I had carried out of a wrecked car 3 years earlier. "He's paralyzed," said a woman near the front, standing halfway from her seat. "How can you say that to a child?" "Mind your own seat," Deborah snapped back without turning. The young man across the aisle lifted his phone higher now, no longer hiding it, recording openly. A flight attendant knelt beside the broken chair, gathering the loose wheel with trembling hands, glancing up at me with an expression that mixed sympathy and helplessness in equal measure. "I need this fixed before landing," Deborah said, addressing the crew as if she were the injured party. "I could have tripped on that thing." Danny's breathing had turned shallow, quick, the kind of breathing I recognized from every hospital room we had sat in together. I crouched beside him instantly, blocking Deborah from his line of sight with my own body. "Look at me," I said quietly. "Just look at me. You're safe." He nodded, but his eyes kept darting toward the broken wheel still rolling gently with the plane's motion. Behind me, Deborah's voice rose again, sharper now, aimed squarely at both of us. "Some parents," she said, "should think twice before bringing children like that on a plane full of paying passengers." Gasps rippled through nearby rows. The recording passenger lowered his phone slightly, shock plain on his face. An elderly woman across the aisle stood fully now, gripping her cane. "That is enough," she said, voice trembling with anger. "You should be ashamed of yourself." "I don't answer to strangers," Deborah shot back, turning her glare on the older woman without hesitation. The flight attendant tried to step between them, arms raised gently. "Please, everyone, let's remain calm and seated." Deborah ignored her completely, eyes locking back onto Danny like a predator who had found its opening. "Maybe if he had a better seat," she said. "Instead of blocking the aisle with his little cart, this wouldn't have happened." Danny flinched, and something inside me went very, very quiet. The purser arrived moments later, drawn by the commotion, her radio still crackling from the cockpit call she had just answered. She surveyed the broken chair, the shaken boy, the woman standing over the wreckage with her arms crossed like she owned the outcome. "Ma'am," the purser said carefully, "I'm going to need you to return to your seat immediately." Deborah straightened her blazer. "Finally, someone with authority. I want that family's seating changed. That equipment is a liability, and frankly, I shouldn't have to sit anywhere near this kind of situation." The purser hesitated, glancing at the growing crowd of recording phones, the murmuring passengers, the schedule pressure written plainly across her face. "We're already delayed for departure," she said slowly. "Perhaps it would be easier if the family moved to the rear galley jump seats until we can sort this out." My stomach dropped. "He needs his chair. He needs to stay where he is." "It will only be temporary," the purser said, not quite meeting my eyes. "We just need to keep the aisle clear for departure." Deborah's smile returned, small and satisfied, as she settled back into her original seat like a queen reclaiming her throne. A flight attendant gently touched my shoulder, guiding Danny's wheelchair remains toward the back, apologizing under her breath the entire way. Passengers watched in silence as I half-carried, half-guided Danny toward the jump seats, his legs unresponsive, his face burning with humiliation he did not deserve. Deborah did not look at us again. She had already turned to check her makeup in a small mirror, as if the wreckage behind her had nothing to do with her at all. Danny's voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. "Everyone's staring at me." I held him steady against the narrow jump seat, my arms doing the work his chair usually did, and felt something inside me shift permanently. And that was the moment I decided Karen had made the last mistake of her very comfortable life. What Danny didn't know yet was that his mother had commanded aircraft through storms far worse than this one. The purser returned 20 minutes later, her radio buzzing with updates from the flight deck about a delayed pushback and a maintenance note regarding cabin equipment damage. Deborah, energized by her earlier victory, had grown louder still, now lecturing a flight attendant about airline policy, as though she wrote it herself. "I want it noted," she said, "that I was forced to sit near a disruption. I expect compensation." The purser's expression remained professional, but exhaustion flickered beneath it. "I understand your frustration, ma'am." "Do you?" Deborah's voice sharpened. "Because I don't think anyone on this crew understands basic customer service." A man 3 rows back muttered something about entitlement, and Deborah spun toward him instantly. "Excuse me?" she said. "Did you say something?" He shook his head and looked away, unwilling to draw her attention further. Deborah turned to the flight attendant nearest her. "I want that man's name. I intend to file a complaint against everyone on this flight." The young woman recording earlier lowered her phone slightly and whispered to her seatmate. "She's going to regret this." Her seatmate whispered back, "Someone should stop her before she does something worse." The elderly woman with the cane, still visibly shaken, leaned across the aisle toward another passenger. "In 40 years of flying, I have never seen anything like this." Deborah, overhearing, rolled her eyes dramatically. 40 years, and you still don't understand basic boundaries." The tension in the cabin had shifted now, no longer scattered whispers but a collective, simmering anger aimed entirely at one woman in a cobalt blue blazer. She stood again, moving toward the galley where I sat with Danny on the narrow jump seat, his legs braced against mine for stability. "I need to know," she said, staring directly at Danny. Who is going to pay for my delay? Danny's breath caught, his hands trembling slightly against the metal armrest. I stood between them without a word, my body a wall she would not cross again. Step back, I said quietly. Or what? She said, leaning closer, voice dropping into something almost threatening. You'll cry to the crew again? Her hand rose, gesturing sharply toward Danny in a way that made two nearby flight attendants tense visibly, ready to intervene physically if necessary. The galley felt smaller suddenly, the air thick and close, every sound sharpened by the silence pressing in around us. I could hear the faint hiss of the coffee maker behind me. I could hear Danny's breath, quick and shallow. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady despite everything. A flight attendant near the rear door reached for her radio, murmuring quietly to the flight deck, requesting standby support at the gate. Another passenger stood slowly from his seat, phone raised higher now, his voice carrying clear and firm across the cabin. Leave the kid alone, he said. You've done enough today. Deborah barely glanced at him. Her focus stayed locked entirely on me, on Danny, on the small trembling space between us. Ma'am, the purser said, appearing suddenly at her side. You need to return to your seat now. Deborah ignored her completely, eyes locked on mine. And who do you think you are? The cabin went utterly silent, every eye turning toward us, every phone rising slightly higher. I reached into my carry-on bag resting against the galley wall. My fingers found the familiar leather case first, worn smooth from years of handling. I opened it slowly, deliberately, and lifted my identification into the space between us. My name is Captain Rachel Monroe, I said quietly. I am the certified commander of this aircraft, currently repositioning in the cabin before my next assigned sector. Gasps rippled backward through the rows like a wave finding shore. Deborah's face shifted first into confusion, then into something closer to panic, color draining from her cheeks in real time. That's not possible, she said, voice suddenly smaller than it had been all flight. You're not even in uniform. I don't need one to know regulation, I said, or to know exactly what you did to my son's equipment and to this cabin today. She stepped back half a pace, blazer suddenly looking less like armor and more like a costume with nowhere left to hide. I didn't know, she stammered. I mean, if I had known who you were. That should never have mattered, I said. Not to him, not to anyone. A man near the front spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the silent cabin. She just admitted she'd have acted differently if she'd known who you were. That says everything. Deborah opened her mouth again, searching for footing that no longer existed beneath her. I closed my identification case and looked past her toward the purser, whose eyes had widened with sudden, dawning recognition of exactly how badly this had been handled. Please contact the flight deck, I said calmly, and have ground security meet us at the gate. 2 uniformed officers boarded within minutes of our early return to the gate, radios crackling, expressions unreadable as they scanned the tense cabin. I met them at the front, showing my credentials again, explaining the situation with the same measured tone I used during any emergency briefing. This passenger damaged assistive medical equipment belonging to a minor, I said, and engaged in escalating verbal harassment toward him throughout boarding. The senior officer nodded, glancing toward Deborah, who now sat rigid, arms crossed, jaw clenched tight against the reality closing in around her. We have multiple witness recordings, the purser added, gesturing towards several passengers already holding up their phones, footage ready. Deborah straightened in her seat. This is ridiculous. It was an accident. He wasn't even hurt. Ma'am, the officer said, we have documentation of intentional contact with secured equipment, plus verbal statements corroborated by at least 6 witnesses. I have status with this airline, she said, voice cracking slightly. I fly this route every month. That status, the officer said evenly, does not exempt you from federal regulations regarding interference with disability equipment or crew instructions. Her composure finally broke completely. This is insane. Do you know who Ma'am, you are being detained for questioning regarding damage to assistive equipment and disorderly conduct aboard a commercial aircraft," the officer said, cutting through her sentence entirely. The cabin, already silent, seemed to hold its breath collectively. Deborah's eyes darted around the plane, searching for support that no longer existed anywhere in that space. "Someone help me," she said weakly, but not a single passenger moved. Not a single voice rose in her defense. The young man who had been recording earlier lowered his phone and said quietly, "You did this to yourself." The officers escorted her down the aisle, her heels no longer clicking with confidence, her shoulders no longer squared with false authority. She paused once beside our row, opening her mouth as if to speak, but the officer at her elbow guided her forward without allowing the moment to land. Passengers watched in complete silence as she disappeared through the forward door. The cobalt blue blazer finally just fabric, stripped of every ounce of power it had pretended to hold all morning. A soft ripple of applause began somewhere near the middle of the cabin, hesitant at first, then spreading row by row until it reached the front. Someone near the exit row called out, "Finally," and a few tired laughs followed, the kind that come after tension finally breaks. The purser exhaled slowly, radioing an update to the flight deck, confirming the aircraft was cleared for reboarding once cabin service completed a final inspection of the aisle and closet track. A ground supervisor arrived shortly after, clipboard in hand, apologizing directly to Danny before addressing me at all. "On behalf of the airline," he said, "I want to personally ensure this is handled correctly, from the equipment claim to the incident report. Make sure it's documented properly," I said, "not just for us, for whoever flies this route after us." He nodded, writing quickly, glancing more than once at the small crowd of passengers still watching from their seats with quiet, careful attention. The purser knelt beside Danny, voice gentle now, entirely different from the rushed apology of earlier. "We're going to get you a temporary chair immediately," she said, "and the airline will cover a full replacement, expedited at no cost." Danny nodded slowly, some color finally returning to his face. A flight attendant knelt on his other side. "I'm so sorry that happened to you. That should never have happened." The elderly woman with the cane made her way carefully down the aisle, stopping beside our row. "You are a very brave young man," she said to Danny, patting his shoulder gently. "And your mother is remarkable." The young mother from earlier approached as well, her toddler now asleep against her shoulder. "I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." "You don't need to apologize," I told her. "None of this was on you." The man who had recorded everything approached last, phone still in hand. "I have this footage if you need it for anything. Whatever happens next, you have proof." "Thank you," I said. "That might matter more than you know." The cabin, once tense and fractured, softened slowly into something warmer, passengers exchanging glances of quiet solidarity now that the storm had passed. Danny leaned his head against my arm. "Mom," he said softly, "were you really flying this plane?" "I'm scheduled for the return leg," I said. "I came aboard early to be with you, and I never imagined I'd need anything more than a mother's patience today." He almost smiled. "Guess she found out the hard way." "She did," I said. "Some lessons only land once the noise finally stops." Ground crew arrived 20 minutes later with a temporary wheelchair, adjusting the footrests carefully while a supervisor apologized repeatedly, promising a full replacement waiting at our destination gate. The captain originally scheduled for our sector met me near the galley, shaking his head as he reviewed the incident report already forming on his tablet. "I've flown 11 years, he said, "and I've never seen anything escalate like that before a single wheel left the ground. Some people," I said, "only understand consequence once it finally arrives in a form they can't argue with." He nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, that took real restraint. Most people would have said something the second she touched the chair." "Restraint isn't weakness," I said. "It's just timing." The cabin, once thick with tension, had settled into something almost peaceful. The overhead lights dimmed low for the remaining boarding process. A flight attendant moved down the aisle handing out warm towels, a small gesture that felt larger than it should have after everything that had happened. I noticed the young man who had recorded the footage sitting quietly now, his phone finally back in his pocket, watching Danny with something like relief on his face. The elderly woman with the cane had settled back into her seat, but she caught my eye once more and gave a small, approving nod before closing her eyes to rest. Even the air itself felt different, lighter somehow, as though the whole cabin had been holding its breath since departure and had only now remembered how to exhale. Boarding resumed within the hour, delayed but no longer tense, the earlier chaos replaced by a strange, communal calm that settled over returning passengers. Danny sat in his temporary chair near the window this time, blanket tucked properly across his knees, his shoulders finally relaxed against the seat back. I took my place beside him, no longer hiding my identity, though I still wore the same plain travel clothes from that morning. The flight attendant who had knelt beside the broken wheel earlier brought Danny a small airline pin, gold and simple, the kind given occasionally to young passengers who showed extraordinary patience. "For bravery," she said, smiling gently. "You handled that better than most adults would have." Danny turned the pin over in his fingers, quiet for a long moment before speaking. "I kept thinking everyone was staring at my chair instead of at me." "They were," I said honestly. "But that changed the moment they saw who you actually are." He nodded slowly, tucking the pin into his shirt pocket like something worth protecting. The engines hummed to life beneath us, steady and familiar, the same sound I had spent half my life trusting completely. Danny looked out the window as the ground began to fall away beneath the wing. "Do you think she'll get in real trouble?" "I think," I said, "she already did. The rest is just paperwork." 3 weeks later, federal aviation authorities confirmed formal charges against Deborah Ashcroft for interference with assistive equipment and disorderly conduct aboard a commercial aircraft. The airline issued her a permanent travel ban across their entire network, citing multiple corroborating witness statements alongside video evidence submitted voluntarily by several passengers. Local news picked up the story within days, though I declined every interview request, wanting Danny's recovery to remain private rather than turned into public spectacle. Danny's new wheelchair arrived precisely as promised, upgraded with features his previous model never had, delivered directly to our door within a week of our return home. He started using it immediately, testing the smoother wheels down our driveway with the kind of grin I had missed seeing on his face. The community around us responded in ways I never expected, neighbors dropping off cards, a local disability advocacy group reaching out to feature his story anonymously as part of an awareness campaign about mobility equipment respect. Danny agreed cautiously at first, then with growing confidence once he realized his experience might help other families avoid similar humiliation in the future. The airline, in the months following, quietly updated its onboard training regarding disability equipment handling, adding specific protocols for securing wheelchairs and addressing passenger interference immediately rather than through delayed escalation. I learned later that the purser involved that day had personally requested to help develop those new procedures, determined that no other family would face what we experienced in that cabin. Deborah's employer, a regional real estate firm, quietly let her go within a month, citing conduct that no longer aligned with the values printed on their website. A local paper ran a short piece on the incident, careful and factual, focused less on her name and more on the policy changes that followed in its wake. I heard secondhand that she moved to another city entirely, though I never confirmed it and never felt the need to look. What mattered more to me was watching Danny wheel himself into school that following Monday, upgraded chair gliding smoothly across the parking lot. His chin lifted in a way I had not seen in longer than I wanted to admit. His teacher later told me he had stood, figuratively, taller in class that week, more willing to speak up, more willing to be seen exactly as he was. Danny still talks about the flight sometimes, though not with fear anymore, more with a strange kind of clarity about how quickly people reveal their true character under small amounts of pressure. "I used to think being different meant being invisible," he told me one evening. "Now I think it just means some people show you exactly who they are faster." I think about that sentence often, turning it over the way he once turned that small gold pin between his fingers. Some people mistake calm for weakness. They see patience and assume there is nothing behind it worth fearing. But real authority rarely needs volume to prove itself. It only needs a single, quiet moment to be spoken clearly. If the story reminded you that dignity does not require noise to win, you already know what that feels like. Some victories are loud. The best ones are simply, finally, undeniable.